Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for those of you that are logging into our session. I'm going to briefly introduce the topic that we're going to be discussing and where we're coming from. If those of you that are in the chat want to type in your information, what kind of setting you guys are working in, what kind of setting you guys are teaching in, we'd be happy to take a look at those as we go so we can hopefully kind of tailor our discussion here today. By way of brief introduction, we're a group of medical educators who are all using and have developed our own tabletop games to teach in the medical setting with quite a variety of learners. Before we introduce everybody, I just want to briefly lay the groundwork of some of the challenges we're trying to address. We teach in a setting of medical school, which is very much dominated for the first year and a half by a high stakes examination called the USMLE Step 1 test, which many students spend a lot of time outside of their actual formal education with outside resources to learn for and are quite um, focused on that. So it's a little bit hard to get the attention of your learner sometimes in that setting. And after that, progressing to later clinical work with later in medical school and subsequent residency, where there is a lot of hard work that the students and residents are doing, and they're very busy. So finding time and focus in those competing situations is very challenging. So we're coming from those sorts of challenges with our games, though I think everyone has their own little experience that they'll share up here. And then let me get into introducing the panel. My name is Michael Cosimini. I'm a pediatrician. I am faculty at the Keck School of Medicine of USC and Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And I'm coming from the perspective of developing a tabletop card game that teaches guideline-based antibiotic use for our students and our residents. Next up, I have Teresa Chan, who is associate professor at McMaster University, waving right there. She's a dean of program and faculty development and the faculty of health sciences at McMaster University, and she is in that corner. Dr. Chan, can you tell us a little bit about the game you've developed in your teaching setting?
Yeah, so I've made two. The first one is this one. It's called Gridlocked, and is a board game about the emergency department. It comes from basically a it's a knowledge translation product for my thesis, which was to figure out how to teach people about multi-patient environments. So in here, basically what will happen is you run around as providers and check off actions and take care of patients as a interprofessional team, really. And then hopefully you survive your shift. And then the other one that we've made is something called Triaged. And so Triaged is a game that helps pre-hospital providers and emergency providers basically learn how to triage mass casualty events. Not pandemic settings, but like if a building falls down or something like that, and make sure that we triage patients properly to the hospitals.
And next I have Paulius Mui, who is a family medicine resident in Virginia, developed his game starting at when he was a medical student. And Paulius, can you tell us a brief one-liner about the game that you developed?
Yeah, hi, nice to meet everybody. My game is called Table Rounds that I've created with my friends, and it's really a game that has cards that with medical terms on them that represent the foundational concepts in medicine, and then you play the game by connecting those cards to each other and explaining how they relate. And so you really, a connection between any two cards, you can have a number of possibilities that really are limited by your medical knowledge and your creativity.
Awesome. And finally here, I've got Bjorn. I forgot to ask how to pronounce your name in the chaos of our technical support. I apologize. You can introduce your last name to us. I'm sorry. He's an assistant professor at the University of Washington and the assistant director of medical education research fellowship. Tell us
Hi,
about
thanks.
what you published.
Yeah, so it's Bjorn Watsjold. And so we put together a game called Clinical Coaching Cards. And this is a faculty development game, and our goal was to teach active learning techniques at the bedside. But we tried to use essentially peer coaching for people to teach each other how to use these techniques.
Awesome. And if you are listening along and you click in the chat, there is a link to some slides that just have a little better pictures of the games. If you want to kind of understand what we're talking about with a little better visual, you can link over to there. Let me ask a question to the whole panel now. I wanted to see, what do you guys see from your experience developing these games, from using these games? What are strengths or weaknesses of teaching with the tabletop game, like when you compare it to other small group teaching techniques that you've tried? Feel free to make a hand gesture if you want to go first. Otherwise, I can call on people.
Happy to go. So I think that, there's a lot of ways that you can develop and use games. And I think, the easiest way would be, think of something you have to teach and figure out way to make it fun, or pick a popular game and figure a way to teach using it. I think that for us, our goal was really that we had content that we wanted to share, but we didn't really want to go to a pure didactic way to teach. And so using a game was a good way to leverage people's kind of the social aspect of teaching and get people to teach each other. And so using a game to give a shared objective, to really structure the way that people interacted was an easy mechanism to get people engaged and get a little bit of competition or a little bit of cooperation to uh, to enable that teaching.
And can I follow up? You kind of use a party style mechanic, right? Where you have a list of options in your hand of teaching techniques that you can use for a particular like educational situation.
Hmm.
Did you had you tried those sessions without the game first? Did people engage in the same way? Like what changed when you applied the game to that, try to teach that content?
So I started with the idea for let's do this as a game, but it took a lot of different ways of play testing it to figure out how this is going to work. Um, and ultimately, the idea was that I knew that faculty had ways that they teach and challenges that they'd had trying to teach. And I wanted people to be able to use the techniques in a way to solve problems that either they had had teaching or that other people had had teaching. And so, in that way, the social mechanic was really a way for multiple people to be engaged and saying, oh, yeah, I do this, I'm going to do that, or, you should try this technique. And that way they could, really engage individually with how the content might apply to their teaching setting or challenges that they had had.
I love it. You're engaging people to learn engaged teaching techniques.
I tried to get as meta as I could.
So meta. So meta. I would say that my perspective would be you really have to pick the right um, game mechanics actually and the right story to link to your objectives, right? Like so, just like we're talking about with that party game, perspective that you have. That Bjorn's used for his game. Similarly for Gridlocked, when we started making, the point of it was to teach people a couple of things: collaboration, right? Multi-patient environment, so they had to be able to run around the board and they had to work towards a goal. And so there was no other way to do it but to think about collaborative games, because we wanted everyone to appreciate each of the players' superpowers, right? So we actually, and this is somewhat ironic now, but we actually ended up picking the base game of Pandemic to mirror off of, because it is not transactional and it's different from the other games. So, for instance, in Gridlocked, you play together to be able to move around the board and play as a team, and you're playing against the board. So a similar mechanic to Pandemic, because you're not playing, you're playing with each other against something else, and so it's you versus the team. And we didn't want it should be a competitive game, right? Because that doesn't make sense with the spirit of what we were trying to teach, which is collaboration and appreciation of the multiple professions to take care of patients together. So that's kind of what was a core mechanic there. Are you speaking,
Paulius,
Paul?
I believe you're muted.
Oh, hey.
There we go. Excellent.
Awesome to hear you share how your game evolved. I think for our game, for Table Rounds, it really the mechanics emerged out of how I studied with my colleagues and friends, and it was just a natural extension of what happens in medicine. Patients come in and they're telling you all these clues, and you can order labs, and that's another clue. And as a physician, you're supposed to piece everything together and identify these hidden connections. And I was surprised that nothing like that existed. And then when we created the game with the medical terms to try to play it, we realized that this was such a good excuse to hang out with people in medicine, because the opportunity cost of um, not studying in medicine is huge. And so people are compelled to try to just be very productive all the time. And so we actually learned that this is a great excuse to just spend time with people and infuse playfulness and creativity into a somewhat rigid structure that doesn't do a good job of achieving these goals. And there are a lot of amazing people working towards changing that type of culture. But just the whole idea of a game-based approach in medicine opened my eyes to how much improvement could happen and how that could affect the wellness of learners. And so that's really kind of the mechanics approach that we've taken.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about it from the perspective is really not an educational tool as directly as a wellness tool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if like we've joked that productive wellness is like maybe a category of a party style game that we're in.
Yeah, maybe. The other thing would be like, well, we did actually a study where we looked at, like drugs get a post-market surveillance when they've gone to market, or vaccines in this case right now, and you monitor for side effects and to make sure that there's not bad ones. But so we actually did a post-market surveillance of Gridlock to see if people were actually doing what like stuff with it. Were they actually teaching with it? Why did they actually intend to buy it? And then we followed up to see and we, it's an incomplete survey. We didn't get like all the responses back, but with the respondents that came back to us and were loyal enough to tell us that what they use the game for, they told us like, we're using it for fun sometimes. And I'm like, sweet. So, we have a paper called Side Effects Include Fun. May include fun, because the idea would be that that's something that people have found is something that we're craving right now. And I think that especially during the pandemic, it's been a way to connect with your family, for instance. And so even pre-pandemic, people were using it to explain their jobs, because the job that we have, right, Bjorn knows, it's hard to explain to some other people. And it's actually hard to explain to learners, which is why we built the game, because a learner will come to the emergency department and they'll leave with the impression that they see a patient at a time, and that's all they have to do. And so, the rest of the House of Medicine thinks that's all we do. And I'm like, that would be like asking like the line chef of salad, like that works on the salad bar, what the chef does. It's not the same thing, right? And so with this, they aren't just focused on one part, one stream. They're actually doing something that's a little bit more complex, and they have to see all the pieces, and they have to understand all the things that are going on. And I think that has been very helpful for some of the trainees who can't see the bird's eye view and can't see where they're going to situate. And as the people get more progressive in their training, it's actually more important as a tactical tool to talk about what's the best strategy to be efficient. And so that's the next stage of what we're working on now.
Can we go? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Paulius.
If I can just follow up, because I think what you shared is really interesting. I was curious if any of your research has assessed the soft skills of, as a side effect also.
It's not a side effect. It was kind of intentionally built. So
Yeah.
if you think about the logic model, like we built it for you to understand multi-patient environments and be able to bounce around and take care of patients. And we built it with the intention that the docs are codependent and interdependent on the nurses. So you can't progress a patient without the nurses being involved, and the nurses can't discharge a patient without the doctor being involved. And sometimes the radiologist and sometimes the consultant. There's like lots of different players, right? And so the idea would be that we understand how interdependent all of these systems are. So very similar actually to the same mechanics in Pandemic, right? In Pandemic, which is a very famous commercial game, the idea would be that you cannot conquer the pandemic by yourself. Like that is a recipe for disaster. You need, as we have seen in this real pandemic, bench researchers through to clinicians to implementation scientists, and we need to have the whole chain come alive in order to survive, right? And so that has been true to form, and I think given an emerge shift, Bjorn can attest, you definitely need interdependence of all the team players to put their feet forward, and when the consultant gets called up to the ward, like if Mike was the peds emerge doc working in our ED and there's an emergency on the ward and he can't admit a patient, then he's going to help for that patient, right? And so we were able to replicate that in that, and so that was the intention of the design. But yes, we did check to make sure that that intentional design facet was held true when we did our beta testing with our faculty for simulation fidelity, and then after that we have tested with the med students in their quality assurance program evaluations of our workshops to make sure that they thought that collaboration and communication was a key skill. The side effect would be the kind of communication they're learning. They're learning closed loop communication, which is very interesting, right? Because what it is that, Mike's moving a character around. He has to actually, there's something in resuscitations we like to use with closed loop communication. So I'll be like, Bjorn, check off two turns for your nurse one. And he'll be like, got it. 2 turns, nurse one. And then so there's that closed loop communication, which after 4 turns with high schoolers, they were nailing it, right? Like I was like, this is a key skill. You're going to have to learn it, practice it. And a 16-year-old can learn how to do that, then there's promise for 32-year-olds.
Can I go back a little bit to the study that you mentioned where you started off on this talking about how you have a post-marketing study? And I think one of the things that's very inspirational about your whole academic arc is how you get so much productivity out of each thing that you do. Can you tell us a little bit about how you set up that study for the post-marketing?
So we were kind of sneaky in that we always wanted to do some level of program evaluation. Like we knew that we wanted to do that up front because we're like, it's a game. I don't even know how people are going to use it. So we wanted to do some exploratory stuff. And so if you go to gridlockgame.com, when you click to buy, it actually takes you to an intake form. And the intake form takes you through some demographic things and then asks you for consent to be called back later. So at the very least, we got intake information as to why you even clicked through to buy. And so we got that. So that's pre-market really, or slightly adjunct to market kind of surveillance. And then after that, you get the exit message from that Google form actually gives you 2 things. One thing that's very useful because the Game Crafter is what we use, and many people in this listening to this probably know the Game Crafter, but it is not the easiest navigation system. So we made our own little guide for how to buy Gridlocked because we're like, this is a disaster. And so we've actually, and no offense to people who are from Game Crafter working in it, it's just that some of our people are not used to computers. They didn't know how to use Zoom before the pandemic. So like we needed to make a step-by-step guide for people to know how to actually purchase the game. And so the idea would be that we did that, and then also a link to the Game Crafter site where they could buy the game. We've done the same thing for Triaged as well. And the idea was just to make sure that we actually did what we were trying to do and that people were buying this for educational purposes, not just for fun, or some people are buying it for gifts. And then what we did was, because we got consent to contact people, we actually went back to them afterwards to say, just like customer service, like, looks like you were interested in buying Gridlocked. Did you end up buying it? If so, let us know how you've used it. And so similar to when you buy a car from Mazda, they send you a customer service survey. Basically, we're doing the same thing. And we did that about 1.5 years into our journey just to double check. And that's what we ended up writing up. And in Canada, because I'm up in Canada, we have an exemption process within our research ethics. It's not considered research if you're actually evaluating a program. And so in this case, we are truly evaluating a program, which is we're selling a board game. We want to make sure it's working in the way that we wanted it to. And so this is clearly non-ethically vague. It was program evaluation, and we reported it not so much as research, but as program evaluation study within literature. We were honest about that.
Yeah, and I stole that method too, and now that's how I'm doing my my free to print versions. I have a link to the printable version after you take a demographic intake survey. So it's kind of interesting to watch who is downloading it and where they're coming from.
Yeah, and then you can also, like I said, if you just add an extra consent question of like, can we ask you later? You could do a focus group. As long as you got as long as you get consent, I think people are willing to give you feedback. Then that's great, right? Like, and some of them were. Not a lot, but 20-something%. I'm like, good enough. Mm-hmm.
We have like a little bit of. Oh, Bjorn, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying, like the lesson there of like not only planning how to get this information, but developing all this, like the downstream effects, is really important. And I think
Yeah.
that this is more about the games than about the faculty development, but
Yeah.
knowing how people are using this,
Yeah.
the long term kind of playtest information is as important as the initial. Does the game work? Is it fun? Did the rules work? What are the gaps?
Yeah, exactly. I think you need a lot of early PDSA cycles too, and that's a very different process, right? That's more design-based research. If you're going to do it that way, that'd be kind of cool. There are actually disciplines in educational design and also in computer science that are very, very, very well set up for mirroring. So if you're using computer science background, if you're building like a video game, for instance, you would probably do a lot of play testing. So I recently consulted with Level X, and they're a computer company that actually like builds games for CPD and continuing professional development. And so they showed me a very early prototype, and I'm like, it doesn't have a skin. They're like, well, that changed, but does this make sense to you? I'm like, not really. And I confessed to them why. I'm like, I don't see blood levels of like carbon dioxide ever. Like I see maybe a continuous CO2 monitor. I might see so I had to give them some fidelity stuff. I'm like, the principles are similar, but I might not always see that. Not in a continuous format. I'd have to press a button and ask for it, right? And so, or call for a lab or something like that. And so there's a time delay that is not a real-time mechanic. And so that was interesting to them because they,
Mhm.
I'm like, we're not constantly sampling people's blood continuously. Sorry. Yeah. And so I think that that's the other part of it too, is fidelity is really important. I think that brings up the point. And when you're designing games, fidelity is super important to try to figure out. And that's why I think it's important to do early playtesting often and make rapid prototyping changes. I don't know, Bjorn, how many prototypes do you think you did with your game?
I mean,
Ballpark.
so Diana and I, ballpark, I mean, we probably did a dozen at least, but
Mhm.
we would do interval, like
Yeah.
iterations. We would reprint the whole thing every time we
Yeah.
did a faculty session with it, so it
Yeah.
would be new design, new language, new cards every
Yeah.
time, partially
Yeah.
because I gave half of them away every time that we did it.
Yeah. There you go.
And,
Yeah.
and so there's a lot of, alpha versions out there.
Yeah. Fair. But Paulius, what about yourself? How many times did you do prototyping?
We've not probably not as we're still prototyping all the time because our game is so modular. It's almost like Legos for
Yeah.
discovering knowledge, and
Yeah.
so we've built some simple Lego pieces like by hand, and then we took it to the next stage to print it in Kinko's,
Mhm.
and then we had focus groups each time, and then even now we're developing new cards, like building those new Lego pieces. And so I think prototyping never stops. It's just how much time do you want to devote to this? And if I can actually add one more comment, which I thought was really interesting, how we talked a bit about the soft skills part of earlier, and you mentioned closed loop communications, and that's an actual like strong asset that you should have as a team member. And one of my assumptions with creating a game was that it actually would serve as a tool for building emotional intelligence in trainees that I don't necessarily think the current medical curricula does a good job of doing intentionally. And you if you're attuned to it and if you have some baseline EQ, then good for you. But if you don't, you kind of have to figure out how to get there yourself. And I think creating the space where games happen, you are really putting people almost in somewhat uncomfortable position, and because you have to be vulnerable and you have to challenge yourself. And I just think that's one comment I had about the soft skills part.
Yeah.
That's my assumption. I would love to study that more formally, but I think it's the added benefit of games broadly.
Well, you
So
might have named a new study idea. Bjorn and I are probably going to be emailing you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like what do you gain from doing the actual development of games? I think that that's ripe for study for sure.
So I would actually take that another step further, and I apologize because I had to step away if I missed some of what Teresa already covered. But I think that it's important to think not only of what are we doing with our games as far as are we trying to teach because there's content on the cards and people engage with that content in an engaging or an interesting or a fun way, and so then you retain the content? Or can you build in another layer of this? And this is, kind of that meta level that we put into our game, and that is in the whole body of Teresa's game, is are you actually doing the actions that you want people to retain outside of the game? Are
Yes.
you is the closed loop communication mechanic of the game actually a real world thing that you want someone to have?
Mhm.
And you can build that. Like if you wanted soft skills, you
Mhm.
could make a game. I think there was the New York Times had that article probably 6, 7 years ago of like 36 questions to fall in love.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay. And so
Right.
a number of people printed those out. I did it actually for a wellness retreat for our residents. I didn't do like all the questions, but
Right.
we had our residents basically do that as a way to like be vulnerable. And this was in the dark days of intern year where everyone, it just feels terrible. It feels like they haven't seen anybody. And
Mhm.
so the action of the game was for people to share, for people to have that vulnerability with each other. And
Mhm.
so I think if you want a game that's supposed to develop emotional intelligence, I mean, you can have people just play, but
Mhm.
people in their 20s and their 30s in medical training, like they've been in the world a long time. If they were going to just naturally
Mhm.
develop emotional intelligence, they would have done it by now. But
Mhm.
so if you want something to encourage that, you need to make them do the things that is going to develop that. And I don't know that we necessarily know what those exact skills or what those actions are, but I think that that's something that would be easily, well, you could plan how to develop it. You could
Yeah.
try.
Well, I would say that, like, this is with my researcher hat on. I think we need to involve people who are doing that primary science. Like, if, Will Bynum is a pretty famous researcher right now in medical education who's studying shame. Well, you know what? A game that looks at shame and vulnerability, right? And helps people process some of that unprocessed trauma from their intern year. Right? Like that's actually something that would be a mechanic and would be a natural knowledge translation from what he is, right? So I think that we need to be challenging our colleagues to think through, instead of just giving a talk at a conference, which admittedly that's what we're doing right now, right? But or like putting a tweet out there or having an infographic. How much better is it for us to think about new and inventive ways to communicate our science to people, right? So I think that there's probably, and maybe Mike, this is a small free version of a game that maybe I could, see you and Mike actually putting together. The idea would be how might you that awkward conversation with like anti-vaxxers. We all need some skills right now to be able to have great conversations with people politely, nicely, so that we can get them to get their COVID vaccine. And for all of you in the audience, if you don't have it yet, we encourage you
Yes.
to get it. But the idea would be that how do we actually operationalize that into a game so that we could practice that awkward conversation before we get on a Zoom with our family and they're asking us all these questions, right? Like, so you could imagine that would be a great, actually, we should probably just build that game. Like, now that I think about it, like, it's probably doable, right? With the
You just slap that on
Bjorn,
top of Bjorn's mechanic. You
yeah,
just make a new
Bjorn,
set.
okay.
Yep.
You just make a new set of cards that are the
So like a
all
joint,
the techniques from the chalk
zones of
webpage.
connection product that we can put out there, and maybe everyone else can help us to get the word out, because it can be free, like your free version of Empiric, right? The idea would be is just here's a bunch of practice statements, and here's some vetted answers that some of the experts have said that you could use, right? We could even probably just find tweets of how people are doing it well.
Mhm.
I don't know. So these are the ideas, right? Like, I think that that's what we need to start thinking about, is how do we let people practice that skill? Because honestly, that's the nice thing about simulation. That's the nice thing about games, is that it's a safe zone where people can practice skills that actually have real meaning. Did we kick it to Andy to see if there's questions?
I don't see any in the chat there. I've got it
Okay.
open.
No worries. Okay. All right.
Bjorn, I was curious. We talked a little bit before or tweeted or something about using like waffling between like a competition versus a cooperative mechanic. What did you learn experimenting with those?
Mhm.
So it was interesting. We had faculty sessions that were 10 people up to 60 or 70 people, but
Mhm.
we usually only had groups of, 4 to 5 or, 8 to 10. We would just give them a double deck and play that way. And Diane and I honestly saw that in any session where we had more than 4 or 5 groups, people came up with their own rules. And it might just be that faculty and physicians, have egos and no one's going to tell them how to play a game, even if they've never played the game before. And occasionally, you'd have the elder statesman kind of, saying, this is how I do this, this is how I do this, and just ignored everything that was happening. But I think that, some groups really did better if we flipped the mechanic. Like, we want you together to show how to use all of these things. We want you to just complete the deck out on the table. And that way they weren't as forced, how do I use this one? It's which ones haven't been used. So let's together figure out how to do this. And that worked
Nice.
really well in some groups where, you didn't have kind of a champion who is like, I, really want to show you all that I know things.
Yeah.
And I think, there's a lot to be said. And part of our conversation, I think, or our chat had been about like the difference. There's a few papers that talk about competition using simulation. People who use like the surgical simulators, where you're picking up beads or triangles with laparoscopic tools. And I think that there's something inherent about competition in that, and that really you're challenging yourself to, do the skill better and faster with fewer mistakes. And you can compare that metric to your, your classmates in your residency or other people, or if, you've got a board on the wall for the fastest, best performance. And so that way it's internally motivating, with those kind of external metrics. I think that that's much different than a collaborative game where, if the goal is to really be able to learn, like say we're doing tabletop rounds, there's a little bit of competition to see, can I find the most esoteric or the most important, connection between these cards? But at the same time, voicing those connections and sharing your knowledge, that collaborative angle allows everybody to learn more. And I think that's a fascinating thing about the tabletop rounds mechanic is that like there's not really a game there in a way. It exists only in the conversation between the people and their engagement with the content and the things that they've learned elsewhere and that they can share. And I'm sure that one person brings up one thing and then people they have those aha moments. And so suddenly you have far more connections than any individual was going to be able to come up with on their own if you had quizzed them or given them 5 minutes and a piece of paper. And so I think that for me, I think it was largely a factor of motivation. If you had individuals who wanted to win, they could drive the game. But if people weren't kind of in that mood or that kind of place essentially to play the game, then collaboratively people could get at least as rich of an experience by trying to figure out how to work together.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Mike's point of view with his Empiric game and how that's a very competitive game from the way that the instruction manual says. I mean, I'm sure there are other ways to play it too, more like a matching game, like Bjorn is kind of describing. Like it could be here's a team based, you get these cards, like do it kind of almost like tables, like the idea would be how does that play out? How does that play out in terms of the mechanics of when you've watched your crew play it?
I think like I love what you just said, Bjorn, about the difference in like what you're trying to teach and when competition and more of a collaborative sort of mechanism makes sense. And I just read that paper and I thought, man, I want to race those surgeons on that trainer and see if I can beat them, right? Like I think something mechanical and tactile like that, you probably are really motivated by competition. But I think for your game and for my game, I think competition is not necessarily beneficial. My game is a competitive game because it's very easy to explain as a competitive game. And I wanted to make things as simple as possible and understandable as possible because I don't want to spend more than 30 seconds explaining the rules to the students, right? So I play it in the context of a clinical setting where there is other stuff going on, and we have to be able to play for 5 minutes at a time if we need to, if things happen. So it's competitive, sort of out of the nature, out of necessity, I think, and for simplicity reasons.
Well, I mean, something I'll note is that between the two of you, you've described two things where repetition is really important. So for me, the gamification part of it, this is where serious games and gamification do have some overlap, although I'd like to talk about how they're different. There's some overlap in when you're trying to create a game that is about something that's a memorization or a rehearsal skill. Actually, to get people to do it over and over again, that's the point. Because the point of the game is that I just need to associate this antibiotic with that bug or disorder, right? And so that like memory game is best done when we actually incentivize the looping of the recall and the retrieval. And so the neuroscience behind it is quite nice because the idea would be just as with kinesthetic repetition, it's a similar kind of incentivization of that repetition, right? And that's why I think competition actually is really useful as a game mechanic when you're actually trying to incentivize that.
But the distracting challenge I find is that if I get two relatively advanced learners playing together, the competition gets out of hand and they get really engaged, and they're not ready. They're not there to learn the ones they got wrong. They're there to get mad about the ones they got wrong, or like argue the rules, or like, so like
Yeah.
if you put two third-year residents that know almost all of the content,
Uh-huh.
it's not that helpful. But if you put a third-year resident with a medical student and they're
Yeah.
playing a competitive game, they're not competing at all, right? The third year resident is coaching the medical student, and they're teaching each other as they play through the cards, and they're repeating. So I think I try everything I can to kind of set it up as a very low stakes environment despite the competitive mechanic. And I think one of the most useful tools in that regard is having an obvious asymmetry in knowledge between the players that are playing.
Very interesting.
Do you feel like there's something fascinating about just witnessing that exchange? So even when you're describing attendings going at it, or the third-year residents, trying to really, or they get heated, for a trainee, like, to me that is so fascinating to observe people like go back and forth like at a high level, and it's just almost like another layer of entertainment and like awe of like, wow, they can just juggle this medical knowledge so like eloquently. And I just think that's so cool. Like, from I'm a resident, I'm in training, and I'm still trying to put all the knowledge into the right places for myself. So creating spaces like that where you get to just be entertained by medical knowledge, I think is very cool.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I love a good morning report where you're going to have a more senior faculty member, kind of show their thought process, or especially when they argue against each other. I think there's so much to be learned in those situations.
Yeah, which is why like a process-oriented game like Gridlocked, and there is no right answer, right? There's no, you are competing against the board. We numbered the cards because we wanted to be able, the dream state is that someday in the world beyond the pandemic, we can actually have a big auditorium where we've numbered all the cards and actually ordered the cards and actually all roll one die, and every table is actually playing the same game literally, and we could actually gamify the meta version of it. So you're collaborating with your team, but you're competing against the other people that are in the same room with the same conditions to see who can optimize their output and their outflow and their process, right?
You can do that on Twitch with the die rolls,
right? Yeah, exactly. So that's the idea. Like, I mean, yeah, we could probably have it distance-based. In fact, that'd be amazing. But the idea would be that we have a leaderboard because people who have played the game and can report their high score can actually report their high score and see how they did compared to other groups. So those are mechanics that we're using to kind of encourage the repeat play because we think the repeat play actually has positive effects in terms of learning. So.
I have a follow-up question on what you just said, because I think this has been a recurrent theme with my experience. You said the phrase that there's no correct answer. And my experience going through medical school is that there's always one correct answer on a test, because the picking that one answer defines your future and the residency you're going to go to, and all of the things that essentially are tied to our identity. And I completely agree. The real world of medicine is so messy, and it's all the stuff that matters is in between the lines, and you can treat hypertension in a million different ways, and patients really don't care what you do, it's how you do it. And so there's a lot of ambiguity with our game as well, and we're trying to nudge a culture of focusing on certainty into a different direction. But still, people keep coming back and saying, can you please tell us what the answers are, because it's like we want to know to move forward. And like, no, the idea is for you to try to discuss this stuff and look it up and discover your own ways of creating it. How have you addressed that issue of there not being a correct answer? Have you struggled with it, or do you think that's not been a dominant part of that you've thought about?
So, I mean, I think that inherently, because of how messy gridlocked is. I don't think people are looking for the right answer. They're looking for strategies to do better. And maybe I guess I could probably do a study and play over and over again to see who gets the most high score, videotape them and reverse engineer what are the best behaviors of that team. But because it's so messy, I think people understand that it's about maximizing, when you have to pick between 5 different patients. I mean, Bjorn does this in the real ED. There is usually sometimes a right answer, right? Like the person that's getting chest compressions probably needs your attention the most. It's just like, or someone that like a baby who is looking a little bit blue and needs some oxygen, right? Or the pregnant lady who pops in is like crowning already. Like these are some priorities that are very obvious. Barring that, right? And this is where, because my research was looking at how different docs actually look at multi-patient environments, and I give them a tracker board full of patients. In my thesis work, I would actually show someone like Bjorn, here's like a tracker board full of patients. What's your plan of attack? And they're super all over the place. And so what I can do is reassure people that there is no right answer in this case. There are some right answers sometimes if the game conditions are correct. And that's why it's nice to do the same thing that Mike does with mixing, and probably what you do with table rounds, right? Like mixing like levels. Because when the med students try to abandon ship and not worry about the secondary recess area, the more experienced doc might say, actually, we can do it. Let's do it, right? Or one time, one of my non-physician colleagues played with our med students and tried to convince them, we should just tend to the minor zone. Don't worry about, like, it's the last term. We don't have to worry about the resuscitation person. Like, we can use our, and they're like, no. And so because they'd already been indoctrinated with enough of the medical culture, they're like, no, we have to take care of the sickest patient first.
Or as
And
the
so
MBA would say, open an urgent care.
Well, that might become part of the expansion pack. Yes, we're actually working on an expansion pack with PAs and NPs and maybe social work. We're not sure exactly yet. We're playing around with that, but that's the idea. Is that like how might we actually use some of those moments to actually layer on some complexity, and I would say that because we're not asking about medical expertise, we have to take that out of the equation. That's why a 7-year-old, like my friend Seth Truger's very famous 7-year-old, or I think she's 8 now, but she's played the game, and that's that she can play it because there actually isn't a dependence on the medical knowledge. We knew that by adding in medical expertise, we would cloud the game too much, and so practicing docs was like, but that's not what I would do. I'm like, okay, that's not the point. Like, zoom out. Like, those could be anything that written next to that, doctor action. It could be anything, right? Like, and so once you actually do that, like it's really funny because the med students and the high schoolers, they jump right in, and it's actually the practicing internist that was like, that's not how you manage CHF. And I'm like, okay, forget about what's on the card. It's all about the doctor and nurse action. So like, oh. Okay, and then they get into the game after that. But it's interesting. The fidelity check is actually really important.
That's I think a challenging part of making a game as complex as yours is that you have some of the aesthetic or the normative aspects that people bring to the game that will change their interaction. And you have people from outside of medicine who will clearly see that there are strategies to the game that may not be realistic.
Yeah.
Or we may find that there are strategies in the game that outsiders do that maybe reveal pathological or ingrained bad habits that we have that we just have in medicine. And
Super
so
interesting. Yeah, like
Ask then about.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask how you guys use debriefing in your games. Then, like,
Oh, yes.
does that mitigate some of that risk?
Yeah, we definitely debrief. I mean, I'm sure Bjorn's game is all about like a bunch of the debriefing as well, right? And we build in that debriefing as like we actually did a study to show that the debriefing would be actually really important because we actually ask the teachers what are some misperceptions that might be perpetuated by this game. And so they named all of them. And so out of that, we were like, okay, here's what we have to make sure we drive home in our debriefing guides. And so when we have lesson plans, we'll actually have key points to say, okay, so in real life, this would be different. In real life, this would be different, just so that we can, unfurl the curtain and show the Wizard of Oz behind, right? Like, it's not as simple as this, right? So that's a big part of it. Paulius, how do you debrief your game? Because like people kind of are doing some of that as they go, I would assume. Do you need extra time afterwards to like unpack stuff at all? Oh, you're muted again for some reason.
We
Okay.
are relatively new on the market, and so we launched this January more
Okay.
formally. And so
Mhm.
we're still in pandemic mode, and people have not been getting together in person. And um, we have built in an element of debrief in a game when it does happen in person. So we hope to kind of see that more often. But the way, so we have like these cards, and you place them next to each other and you build essentially this grid, like a mosaic. And that can take anywhere from 15 to, an hour, however long you play. And then in the end, we have one person run the list. The way you do it in a hospital is you would review the patients that you had created plans for, and then you just have a person pick a destination from one end of the board to the other to reteach the connections that they've learned throughout the game. And it's interesting. It's some people almost come up with an entirely different connection that was not mentioned, but they just ended up creating new knowledge along the way, and then it's a way to reinforce something. So it's not a true debrief, but it's an interesting way to kind of solidify some of the things that you've learned.
It's almost like a game recap, right? It's kind of like with
exactly.
yeah. I was gonna say what it's interesting about your game is that when I first saw it, I was like, this is like medical dominoes. Like, like to me, that was that's what immediately came to me, like in terms of like the game mechanics. So, yeah, the way that it works out is it's not as obvious in dominoes why things are connected, though, right?
Yeah, so I'm actually not really into games prior to this. So every time I tell about table rounds, someone says, "Oh, you can play it like apples to apples, or you could play it like Cards Against Humanity, or like dominoes." There was someone who was, I think, from Ecuador, and so we always played this, and you can use these rules, and that's the crazy part, that these are just building blocks, and you can use them whichever way you want, and it's kind of cool. So I end up having to look up all these games that I've never played, and yeah, you could adapt it like that.
Yeah. Bjorn, how do you use debriefing in yours?
So, I mean, a lot of ours was just the follow up, essentially. How does this working? What's not working? We had many levels in a lot of our sessions where we'd have medical students, we'd have residents, like early and late residents, and we'd have faculty at multiple levels. And so it was helpful for us a lot of times to discuss with people, like some of these techniques are in the literature, some of these techniques are semi-made up. And so all these different bedside teaching techniques do these seem like something you would use? Do these seem like something that you could use? Are there parts of this that might be problematic? And so a couple of the techniques were homebrewed from University of Washington, and people described like how challenging it could be to try and use them, especially as we try in medicine to be more and more sensitive to um, diversity in all its forms. That there was a technique where essentially you had someone walk into the room and kind of Sherlock Holmes in a patient's room. Are there photos in there, or is there a wheelchair in there, like, and what can you tell about this person by these things? And people were really on the spot to say, like, well, you may be revealing really your own biases far more than anything about that patient by doing this exercise. And so the faculty, were kind of split of like, oh, I don't really want to wade into that. That could get really challenging, and we could really kind of damage our relationship with the patient. And other faculty thought, well, no, really what you want is you can allow this to be a teaching, moment. You don't necessarily want the student to impart their biases on the patient. You want the patient to be able to say, this is who I am, and these are the things that I have here with me that I need you to know about. And so parts of it was really that we had to take the debrief as a way to teach about the techniques in ways that might have been missed in people's playthrough. And the ways that people might try and use a technique needed a little bit of coaching, much kind of like the debrief that you use in Gridlock, to say these are the parts that really wouldn't work in the real world, or this is what you would want to tweak. We had to use the same thing. what was fascinating is that like we had, I think, 14 techniques, and we never had the same favorites. I mean, over all the play tests, I mean, we have a kind of a tier of
Mhm.
what ones people really like and what people don't like. But it
Mhm.
only took one person with a good idea. It's like, this is how I would do this. And they would skew an entire session where everyone would be like, that's a great idea. We want that one.
Mhm. That's great. And have you been using debriefing yourself, Mike, in your game?
I'm very brief on the tail end of it. I really do most of the work up front, like
Mhm.
setting the tone, saying, "Hey, would you guys like to play a game or do a talk?" Like I always sort of like consent them into the game as a teaching method because I
Mm.
do worry sometimes that students will think a game is not an effective way to teach them. I firmly believe that active learning techniques are great and this is a really effective way to teach, but I sort of like consent them into using that as our teaching session for those 15
Like
minutes versus
Morpheus, right? Red plume,
yeah, right.
plume.
Yeah, right. We can do a chart. We can do the whiteboard, or we can do the game. Which one do you want? And then once they go into the game, like saying, "Hey, at the tail end, I'm going to ask you to show me one of the cards and tell me what you learned." And at the
Mhm.
tail end, it really is just like reiterating one piece of knowledge per learner of one thing they learned from the game session.
Yeah. Okay. So just reaffirming again what it is. Yeah.
It's
The
very concrete
debriefing.
in my game.
Yeah, the debriefing in Gridlocked has been quite complex at times. Like people will really want to dive in about some of the mechanics that work or don't work, or like should we have done it this way or should we have done it another way? But they tend to almost real time debrief. It's very interesting. Like usually the debriefing's not as long as I thought it would be after doing the focus groups with the faculty about where they thought we should, like make sure we did debriefing. But like the residents and the med students that do the workshops usually are like, yeah, we know that that's not like not everyone has the same consistent practice pattern. Like not everyone's gonna have the same workflow at different times of the day. They're like, we know that, but it gave us a good sense of what's actually happening, right? So
I wanted to follow up on the kind of the extension of debrief when the game stops, because I've tried Empiric, Mike's game, but not either of yours just yet. And what I liked is that Mike actually has the QR codes on the cards
yes.
that allow you to extend your knowledge after the game is over. And I'm curious if Mike, if you don't mind sharing, if you've created these with any intent of being used out after the game is over as like a way to almost debrief with yourself or reference knowledge that you've um, germinated during gameplay. I don't know if you've ever thought of the QR codes to serve that function, or it's just something of as a reference in real play only.
Let me answer that, and then after I answer that, I'm going to swing that question back to you about your experience using your game and sort of online implementations. But the QR codes, I think, has really been like a total failure. If I'm going to be very blunt about
Really?
it, I put the QR codes in there because I'm like, there's such limited information on the cards. I can't like I'm not there in the box. I want people to have access to more information. So I
Uh-huh.
sort of basically wrote like a little textbook, like 2 paragraphs for each of the 40
Huh.
cards, and a lot of a lot of additional information and sort of explanation for why the choices are what they are online. But I tracked the QR code use, and like for every copy of the game that's been sold, there's like less than one QR code use per copy of the game sold. So I presented that as a poster, but it's they're very infrequently used by other people. I still use them because I want to remind myself when I'm teaching, oh shoot, what was the reason why I put that there?
Mhm.
And just to prompt myself. But I think that the digital tabletop integration was not successful there. I was at a session yesterday where one of the panelists said that if you can play the game without the app, you failed with like a hybrid sort of mechanic. And my game isn't really a hybrid; it's just a reference on there. But that was really left me thinking. I think
Mhm.
I don't think it's super desirable to use a digital tabletop hybrid unless there's a very good reason.
I actually really like it as a selling feature. It was a selling feature for me as a teacher that you were doing that. So I wouldn't give it up yet just yet because I think as a teacher, it's a great way for you to scan the QR code and cheat a little bit for someone who's not an expert in infectious disease. So you may find that there will be other uses. So like don't go off of just the Google Analytics. I think there's other reasons why people might be using it. But
I completely agree. I think you might be maybe like ahead of your time of doing that. Not that I know really what the lay of the land is, but I think
yeah.
just stick with it for sure. I think that is just nascent right now.
Yeah.
Paulius, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing online with Table Rounds?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, this is more of a response to us trying to accommodate it in times of COVID and launching a product that is meant to be played in person when everybody is isolating. I know that's changing somewhat now, but I've kind of struggled with this component a lot. And with my team, we've discussed extensively of really the game we've made is meant for you to unplug and for you to be social and present with people around you.
Mhm.
And that's really the aim. And we've thought about it long and hard how the point of creating an app would be really counterproductive to what we're trying to, what our message is. And so we've done some Twitter experiments where we've essentially handed people cards and had them tweet, "Hey, this is my card. What can you connect to me?" Just almost as if this was like an icebreaker in a real start of a residency or med school, and each person got a card and they wore it on their name tag, and then someone would walk up and try to share a teaching point and whatnot. We just did it virtually as like a way to do something fun and see if it would work, and it took off. And then we did another version where we just uploaded some cards to Google Jamboard, which is a white virtual board that many people can use collaboratively, and that also took off. So I think it's just that it was a response to us not being able to be present in the same physical space together, and then the fact that it got a lot of traction is just evidence that there are so many people wanting to connect.
Yes.
No pun intended, like really that's, or a pun intended I meant. But so yeah, so I think it's just really fun. So if anyone's curious, I really like you and I were talking about like how can we play Empiric online, because I would love to, like I'm kind of trying to find people to do it with, but it's hard. Curious, Bjorn, if you've ever thought about taking your game to the internet.
We hadn't thought too much about going online. I think we, in the other direction, actually had offered the game, the cards by themselves as like a pocket resource, especially for like not as academic of faculty. Like our medical school has far-flung teaching sites, and we have a lot of preceptors who don't have a lot of teaching or teaching on teaching or how to teach. And so we had offered just the content of the game as being like a resource for, where they could have a medical student for the day and say like, oh, I don't really know what I'm going to do with this person today. Flip a card and be like, okay, this is my strategy for the day, or I'm going to try this for a couple patient encounters. And if that's working, great. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to flip another card. I'm going to try that.
Mhm.
I think that the content of it wouldn't be hard to do in a setting like this. It'd actually be pretty easy.
Yeah, I wonder if
and
an app would be actually quite good for yours, because it is just about randomizing a card. Like you could prototype on probably one of those flashcard apps that people have for drilling their flashcards. You could probably prototype with that pretty quickly, actually.
an Inky. I mean,
Yeah.
but
Folks,
we could also
we just have a
put it in
few more
Tabletop
minutes
Simulator.
left. Anything else you want to wrap up with before we talked about where we can reach you?
I think we're good. Yeah.
Yeah, I will repaste our Twitter contacts into the feed here so that everyone can have those.
Yeah.
Anyone want to be reached somewhere other than Twitter?
Yeah, people can find our gridlockgame.com is probably where I'd point people. There's a way you can get in touch with us through the website, and I'll respond within, I think, legendarily, I'm known to respond within hours, minutes, or seconds, depending on how on my email I am that day. So feel free to reach out if this is interesting to you, if you want to learn more about either the game production side or the medical side of things around kind of like the game construction, let us know.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Bjorn, anywhere else besides Twitter?
Twitter is a great spot to find me.
Yeah, and my Twitter was at TeachNMD, which was showing before. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Paulius?
I'm still pretty new to Twitter, so trying to get a hang of it. But yes, that's a good spot. We have a website called playtablerounds.com where we outline. There's more written about why and how we created the game. So I think that's a cool thing to check out. And I'm always interested to connect with people who are curious like me and want to also create their own thing. And I think that's maybe the hope of us coming together in different ways is to share these methodologies, these approaches that could be replicated. And I think the hope is that more people will be doing stuff like this at different institutions, and in the end the impact will be a very positive one on the culture of medical education, and in turn that should translate into better students, better residents, and better physicians ultimately, and that leads to, I think, better patient care.
That's a beautiful summary. Maybe we should leave it there. Thank you guys. I really appreciate you taking the time and getting to like chat with you guys. I've learned a ton here, and thanks so much to the organizers. I'm sure this was a lot of work to put together, and I really appreciate you guys hosting this and giving us this opportunity.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andy.
This has been great. Thanks.